Welcome, and Ramadan Mubarak to everyone watching today. As part of the Justice in Ramadan conference online through this weekend, our NGO, Justice for All, seeks to raise awareness of numerous situations of persecution and injustice, especially against minority communities. I have been working with our program, Burma Task Force, since mid-2013. My name's Adem Carroll, and I'll be moderating today's session. Unfortunately, since 2013, we see Rohingya suffering greatly increase due to the policies of the Burmese military and Burmese government, aided by the weakness of international response and the complicity of certain governments. In Burma, over the past decades, there have been numerous waves of mass displacement in response to military assaults against various ethnic minorities, but especially against the disenfranchised and effectively stateless Muslim minority, the Rohingya of Rakhine State. Since early autumn of 2017, when over 700,000 Rohingya fled the brutal and genocidal attacks of the Burmese military, which perpetrated mass atrocities and extensive scorched earth tactics throughout Rakhine State, Bangladesh has been hosting the largest community of Rohingya refugees, though the government does not officially recognize them as such. Many Bangladeshi and Rohingya are extremely cautious about criticizing Bangladesh government policies and prefer to emphasize the sacrifice that Bangladesh has made to host this population. However, the premise of this panel is that criticism can be constructive. All the guests today have firsthand knowledge of refugee camps, especially the situation in Bangladesh, where there are now over 1 million Rohingya held in the world's largest collection of refugee camps in the Cox's Bazar area. Current concerns about the spread of the coronavirus give heightened urgency to this discussion today, considering the situation of Rohingya trapped in the world's largest camps and the particular risks to this vulnerable and traumatized population. I will be introducing all the speakers now in the order they will be speaking. First, AK Rahim is a sociolinguistic researcher who has worked in both Bangladesh and Burma from 2017 to 2020. He has worked with several organizations in different capacities, the most recent being the International Organization of Migration. His work and research focus on the intersection of language, political identity, and humanitarian services. Next, Matt Wells, Senior Crisis Advisor for Amnesty International, focuses on the specific impact of conflict on children, women, people with disabilities, and older people. He has more than a decade of experience carrying out human rights investigations across Africa and Asia with a focus on situations of armed conflict and major crisis. Matt is a co-researcher and author of 5 reports on Burma, including the military atrocity crimes against the Rohingya and war crimes in Kachin and Shan states. Athena Rayburn is the head of advocacy, communications, and media for Save the Children's Rohingya response. Athena's background is in policy and advocacy with a focus on children and women's rights. Her work, while at Save the Children, has been focused on ensuring access to quality education for Rohingya children, including working on security approval from the Bangladesh government to use Burmese curriculum in the camps. Previously, she was based in Nepal, New York, and Turkey. And finally, Osama Siddique is the son of Rohingya genocide survivors from Rakhine State. He has lived with and visited many Rohingya communities around the world, including Saudi Arabia, UAE, Pakistan, Malaysia, and Burma. He has been raising the voice of Rohingya refugees and specifically working on developing educational systems for the rising generation of Rohingya. Special thanks to Bubba Murray, Justice for All staff member working out of our Chicago office, who is assisting with the production of this show, including any visuals and links. So we will begin today with AK Rahim, who will speak from his experience of over 2 years working in the camps. What was this experience like, especially for a sociolinguist? What are the cultural and communication challenges for humanitarian agencies? And what implications do these challenges have on the current crisis?
Thank you, Adam. Thank you for having me. If you don't mind, I'm actually going to share my screen and I'll do a really short presentation. If I can get my... Are we able to view this?
No? Yes. No?
Yes? Can you see it now? Adam, can you confirm if you can see this?
No.
Okay, the screen apparently is not up, so I'll just speak without the presentation. As Adam mentioned, I've been working in Myanmar and Bangladesh, mostly in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh, for the past 2.5 years. And I worked as a sociolinguistic researcher. Now, what does a sociolinguistic researcher do? We're not just focused on language, we're actually focused on the social repercussions of language itself. In this context, we have a very varied, we can call it a rich linguistic landscape where you not only have Rohingya language, but you also have Rakhine, Burmese, Bangla, English, of course, through the humanitarians, and various other languages and scripts as well. So it's a very complex, from a research perspective, once again, very rich place for research, but it's also very harrowing in many ways because you have a community, a very underprivileged community that had very little access to standardized education, either in Burmese or in Bangla, who have very limited access to English as well. And they have, also a language. Rohingya itself is not a standardized language. It doesn't have any script. It doesn't have, well, it has script, but it's not formalized. So it's very difficult to communicate. When we think of other refugee contexts, whether it was in Syria or, Venezuela, etc., you have very easy language transaction. Basically, you have
We're having some technical difficulties, and we're going to take AK off for a minute. So maybe he can call in again, or we can fix that. But let's see. Is this better? Let's try. Go ahead.
Am I back on, hopefully?
Yes, yes, you are.
Okay, apologies for that. Once again, various languages have very standardized language, but Rohingya doesn't. So how do you communicate with a group of people that can't explain to you how they feel in terms of health or how they feel in terms of emotions or even what their needs are? They can't explicitly write it to you. So if you have a complaint box in the camps, if you don't have a script or a script for them to write with, whether it's in Rohingya or Burmese or Bangla, vast majority of them don't know how to write Bangla. They may know how to write. Oh, here's the screen. If you can go down to humanitarian language, it's further down. Yeah, there you go. And the next slide. This basically shows the various language flow within the camp. You have the humanitarian community, you have the Bangla program staff, Chittagonian interpreters. So it's not just the Rohingya people themselves that have a language barrier. There's also the service providers, whether it's the nationals, Bangladeshi nationals or the local Chittagonian community. And same thing in Myanmar, whether it's the Burmese speakers or the Rakhine speakers, they can't communicate directly with the Rohingya community. So, for example, you have a doctor in Bangladesh, in Cox's Bazar, who's from Dhaka, and that doctor primarily speaks Bangla. The Rohingya population, they cannot communicate directly with the doctor, so you will need an interpreter, and that interpreter is usually a local Chittagonian from the region of Chittagong in Bangladesh. On the other side of the border, similar concept. You basically have Burmese or non-Burmese, whether it's a Shan or a Chin doctor that comes into the camps, and they can't communicate directly with the Rohingya people. And they also need an interpreter there. So there's a lot of gaps. There's lots of information lost through the interpreters, and also there's sensitive topics that aren't necessarily they don't come across through the interpreters because people are shy, especially women. Through our research, we've seen that the Rohingya women have something that we can call a sociolect. Within the language, you have a subset or a divergence of language that only the women speak. The men themselves, even Rohingya men, don't understand some of these vocabulary. And that's because they live very secluded lives. They live within parda, behind, the safety of men, or etc. So basically, they don't have access to education. They don't have access to markets or doctors. So they don't necessarily get exposed to vocabulary and terms that can help express themselves more easily. So all these are challenges, and to address these challenges, I worked with a couple of organizations, primarily Translators Without Borders. We've created a glossary, a multilingual glossary. Bob, if you can go down further, further down a little bit more. Yeah, it's 15, slide 15. We have a glossary in it's multilingual. It's in Bangla, Chittagonian, Rakhine, Burmese, and English, of course, with audio clips as well, that help humanitarians basically bridge that gap with the Rohingya people. It's also written in different scripts, so whoever has access to it, whatever language they speak or read, they can try to use these words. We also create guidelines, sector-specific guidelines, so whether it's health or education or nutrition, etc. We basically do very broad research, and we look at what are some of the linguistic barriers in these sector-specific services, and we create guidelines. And the other thing is we've been doing lots of research on various services, but also social constructs and other social attributes of the Rohingya people. So whether it's the Samaj, which is the community structure that they try to replicate in the camps after fleeing from Myanmar, or whether it's the gender barrier in health, we have various research reports that came out to the humanitarian community and also anyone that's interested at large. And also through a lot of these papers and research, we've realized that the Rohingya population is also very very open to new ideas. So there's actually new words being created in the camps. And some words that are extremely creative, words that don't have direct translation. So basically, they have to come up with new words. And I've been talking to my colleagues. I'm back in the States now, but my colleagues back in Cox's Bazar, how are they addressing the new COVID response? Well, it's interesting because plagues and pandemics, etc., they're not new to this phenomena. They've went through over the centuries various different outbreaks, whether it's cholera or typhoid, etc. So they do have words for epidemics, but they don't necessarily have a word for something as specific as COVID. And then how do you address the various social distancing, instructions that are being implemented there? How do you talk about that? How do you even say those terms in the Rohingya language? Those are things that we've worked towards, and we've created videos. Audio and video are usually the most helpful, and also the most productive, because you don't necessarily need literacy. You don't need someone to read or write. So they just listen to these audio and video, and they replicate it, and they disperse this knowledge. So this dispersal of knowledge is very robust. It usually flows from humanitarian to various different subgroups within the population through different vectors, and we try to get those different groups of people in these vectors to understand our messages really concretely in various different languages, whatever languages that they understand, whether it's Rohingya, or Burmese, or Bangla, or Chittagonian, and we make sure that the message comes across strongly. So yeah, that's from my end, language in the Rohingya response. It's a very, as I said in the beginning, very challenging landscape, but at the same time, considering the resiliency of the population, as a researcher, it was very profound to see how many languages can coexist within one context. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I have one quick follow-up question. I understand that for some of these words that don't exist in Rohingya language, and the word for diarrhea, which may or may not be a symptom of COVID, but certainly there's a lot of health issues in the camps. It wasn't recognized by the Chittagonian translators at first. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's an example that I love giving, because it's so the word for diarrhea in Rohingya is ga lamani, which if you take it's a compound word, ga meaning body and lamani means to bring down. So when a Chittagonian interpreter heard those two words, they took it out of, they didn't understand the context, or they directly interpreted to the English English-speaking humanitarian, that his body is falling apart. He didn't know that that word itself meant diarrhea. So you have a lot of those lost in translations and cognates, etc. And with the current COVID response, you'll have terms like social distancing that will be difficult to translate. You'll have terms like cough, or hoarseness, throat hoarseness, etc. That could be difficult to translate, simply because the way we describe certain symptoms are very medical, are very concrete, but those medical terms don't get concrete words in other languages, particularly one as unstandardized or unwritten as Rohingya.
Communication issues have been a factor in U.S. Failure to deal effectively with the coronavirus. And so it's always an important aspect of all of these crisis situations. Another aspect of communications is to be able to be online, as we are now. And I understand that in the camps, there's, I'm sure we'll be speaking about restrictions on internet and perhaps cell phone service. You had been active in creating an app that would help in translation. Have the restrictions really shut down that app from being used?
So in the development stage, we figured that there would be an issue with internet connectivity. So we made sure that our app is actually downloadable. You can download it and it works offline. Excuse me. So of course, with that said, it's still difficult to download these apps, whether it's due to its large size or just exposure. But we are trying. We wherever we go, we try to tell people like, here's an app, and try to download it, and we make sure that they download it in front of us. So if there's any technical issues, we can address it with them right there in the room.
Well, thanks. Well, going to the next speaker for now. Matt Wells was author of an earlier report on the special needs of older Rohingya refugees in the camps. But just on the 6th of April, Amnesty issued another statement of concern entitled Bangladesh COVID-19 Response Flaws Put Older Rohingya Refugees in Imminent Danger. So jumping off from that, Matt, what kind of update would you like to give us about these concerns?
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this. So maybe to back up a little before getting specific to the issues related to COVID and building off how you opened, Adam. I think one of the things that's really important to understand and recognize related to older Rohingyas' experience in particular is that for many of them who are in the camps now in Bangladesh, this is not the first time that they have been forced to flee. So we, as you said, I put out a report last year that looked at the specific experience of older people in various conflicts in Myanmar. And one of the things that was so striking is how many people I interviewed who had been forced to flee to Bangladesh not twice, not 3 times, sometimes 4 times in the course of their life during different waves of atrocities by the Myanmar authorities. At times, especially amongst some of the particularly old refugees I was interviewing, all the way back to the period of World War II, the first time that they were forced to flee to what is now Bangladesh from what is now Myanmar in the 1940s, and then again in 1978, again 1991, 92. And so now, this is a part of the population that has experienced recurrent trauma throughout their lives. They have been subjected to repeated atrocities by the Myanmar military at different stages of their life, in addition to the daily persecution that existed within Myanmar that we at Amnesty have said is a system of apartheid, and which remains very firmly in place for the Rohingya who continue to live in northern Rakhine State. And the other, I think, key background thing to understand in terms of older people's experience of the conflict, I think there's often a perception that older people are spared or less affected by conflict in general, that armed actors, even when they're committing horrific abuses, tend to target, say, children in terms of forced recruitment and use of child soldiers, or target women for rape and other forms of sexual violence, target men who are perceived to be of fighting age. All of those things are, of course, true, and were absolutely part of the military's atrocities against the Rohingya. But when MSF, for example, did a quantitative look at mortality during the acute period of the Myanmar military's operations from the 25th of August through late September of 2017, what they found is that Rohingya who were 50 and older died at enormously disproportionate rates, even compared to other parts of the Rohingya population, 3-4 times the rates of people who were under 50. And from all of the testimonies that we took at the time, we know, for example, that at times older people couldn't flee and were still inside their homes when the Myanmar military burned every last home, mosque, and other structure in Rohingya villages, that they were shot as they weren't able to flee as quickly as other parts of the population, that they, in walking through the mountains between Butidong and Mongdo townships in northern Rakhine State, faced particular challenges that again led to dying at enormously disproportionate rates. And so again, I think the backdrop of where we are now in the camps in Bangladesh is understanding that there is a particular and disproportionate impact on older people of the military's atrocities, and the fact that they have lived through recurrent trauma in particular throughout their life. And the second kind of thing that I think is important to set the stage is that humanitarian operations in general struggle in responding to the specific rights and needs of older people. And a big part of our report last year was looking at that all the ways that the Bangladesh authorities and humanitarian operations in Cox's Bazar were falling short in meeting older people's specific needs. We know, for example, and I'll see if I can share a photo here, but it's an extremely hilly terrain in Cox's Bazar. This is a challenging environment, and many of the older people that I interviewed, they had difficulties in terms of navigating that hilly terrain. And oftentimes there is an assumption that people will be able to get to a distribution point or a water point or some other centralized location. And if you have challenges navigating the hilly terrain of Cox's Bazar, then oftentimes older people are left behind in terms of the basic humanitarian response. This is also true in terms of there's been woefully inadequate care for non-communicable diseases like hypertension, diabetes, chronic respiratory illness. These have been inadequately responded to, which means that many illnesses that older people disproportionately face haven't been adequately treated even prior to the situation related to COVID-19. And so that, of course, then presents all the more risks specific to COVID-19. So to get to that particular issue, so in the last couple of weeks of late March, early April, I interviewed older people in the camps, and the first thing to note, I think, for those who haven't been to Cox's Bazar, is that this is an incredibly packed area. As Adam said in the opening, the largest refugee camp in the world, and from what I've seen from data from UN agencies, a population density that is almost double Manhattan in terms of how tightly congested people are packed in their homes, one on top of another, bamboo shelters with tarpaulin, in a way that the idea of social distancing in the camps is impossible. And amongst that population, we know from UNHCR statistics that there are at least 31,500 older Rohingya refugees, so people who are 60 and older in the camps. And that, again, given the lifetime of persecution that they have been subjected to, that many of them have comorbidities, serious health conditions that put them at particular risk for COVID-19 based on what we've seen around the world. And a team at Johns Hopkins recently did modeling for Cox's Bazar, and one of their findings was, and I'm quoting here, that a large-scale outbreak is highly likely after a single introduction of the virus. Again, just given how congested it is, we know if COVID-19 reaches the camps that it will spread rapidly throughout, given how many people live in such a small area. And we also know that the health system in the camps and in nearby Cox's Bazar is woefully unprepared for this. Again, from that Hopkins study and modeling, what they reported is that there's only one facility with just a few mechanical ventilators in the camps, and at the Cox's Bazar hospital itself, the Bangladeshi hospital in the nearest town, has fewer than 10 ICU beds and no functioning ventilators. So the ability to respond in terms of, again, the health needs that are likely to happen if COVID reaches there are enormous. But one of the things that came out of this research that we did, and the statement that you referenced, Adam, is that on top of that, there is a disturbing lack of information that is reaching older Rohingya men and women in the camps. And as you just talked about, a big part of that relates to Bangladesh shutting down communications since September of 2019. That since then, the ability to get SIM cards, to have mobile phone data, internet in the camp has been largely cut off, which has really cut off the flow of information into the camps generally. So when we did this recent research, I interviewed 15 older Rohingya women and men. Very few of them had received accurate information about the symptoms of COVID-19, of preventative measures to help reduce the risks of spread, much less supplementary assistance related to new distributions of soap or alcohol-based hand rubs or other things that would actually allow them to implement preventative measures. And I'd like to I think it's always important to try to give voice to some of those that I've interviewed, to hear their words directly. So one of the men I interviewed, Abdul Salam, who's 70, and who told me that he has a physical disability that makes it difficult for him to walk amidst the camp's hilly terrain. About COVID-19, what he said is, quote, "I didn't hear any new things, just people are saying a disease is coming, pray. I don't know the name of the disease. Here, no one did any meeting on the disease. No NGO people have told me about the disease. Just other people who live here are saying, pray more and more, one disease is coming. People are saying there's no medicine for that disease, so what more should I do?" End quote. And there have been, I would say, some creative efforts by the Bangladesh authorities and humanitarians. For example, and maybe some of you have seen videos in which there have been megaphones put on tuk-tuks to try to blast messaging through the camps. But again, one of the things that comes across is that for older people in particular, there may be particular challenges in terms of accessing that messages. So for example, I interviewed some older women and older men who were hearing impaired, and they could tell that there were messages being blasted, but they couldn't actually hear them themselves. And so again, to quote one of them, there was a woman I interviewed named Sayeda, who's in her 80s. She also hasn't been receiving food assistance because she was unable to walk to where the registration occurred. And so she was having to rely on an adult son. And about COVID-19, what she said, again, quote, "I don't know anything about that virus, just people are saying something about a virus on the megaphone, but I don't hear well. That's why I don't know anything. I'm always thinking, what are they saying on the megaphone? No one told me to do anything, just my son told me to pray, so I just pray always." And I guess the point here is, I mean, imagine, a situation in which we all know, those of us speaking today, those of us who I imagine who are watching today, we have been bombarded with the risks of COVID-19, about what to do to try to best protect ourselves, and try to put yourself in the shoes of a people who, after all that they have gone through, after all of the persecution by the Myanmar military, after what they've had to get through in order to flee to Bangladesh for their safety, are now, in the face of this pandemic, not even being provided the most basic of information about what this disease is and how they can best try to protect themselves within the difficult environments in which they live. And so I think, a key here is that generally in humanitarian response, there is a need to be far more inclusive of older people, to design programs and to ensure that messaging reaches them, taking into account the specific risks and needs that older people face. And the other thing, and it goes back to your opening about, we need to be able to speak critically. The fact that the information blackout continues in terms of internet and telecommunications is unacceptable. And I think, it's very encouraging that UN agencies, international humanitarian organizations have all called this out. But it's critical that countries around the world put pressure to ensure that blackout ends, to allow, again, a kind of increased flow of information into the camps, because it is essential that we allow the most basic of information to get to the Rohingya population, to ensure that then they're in the best position to implement preventative measures in response to this. I'll stop there.
Matt, oops. Before I ask Athena Rayburn to comment, I wanted to ask you, Matt, you and AK Rahim have both spoken about challenges to communication. He from a perhaps cultural point of view and linguistic, and you from the policy point of view of shutting down communications in the camps as a Bangladesh government decision. Do you and older people have suffered in a particular way from the genocidal policies of Burma? These older people are at most risk from the virus as well, so they're doubly targeted and doubly vulnerable. They are not, as you said, able to navigate the hilly terrain of the camps easily or to access whatever efforts that are made. What do you think that humanitarian agencies are able to do in that landscape?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly don't want to, not acknowledge the challenges. It's an incredibly challenging environment. I think one of the things that the current situation shows is the need to ensure that programming and responses is more inclusive from day one. That it's really difficult to try to implement this in the best way right now in the midst of an emergency. There's a need really to start from the beginning of a humanitarian crisis. And so I think some of it is, for example, acknowledging and finding those who are most at risk. So one of the common assumptions in humanitarian response is that older people are provided for by others, right? That they have family who will take care of them. And what our reporting and others have shown is that, in fact, there are actually many older people in the camps in Bangladesh who are living alone, or who themselves are primary caregivers for young children because maybe their adult children were killed by the military or detained by the military. And so particularly for older people living alone, older people who are acting as primary caregivers, it's essential that they be identified in humanitarian response, and that then programming be designed to meet their specific needs. So that may be, instead of requiring someone to walk half a kilometer in a hilly terrain to a camp clinic, knowing to identify those people in the first place, and then be able to put together mechanisms such that either you can provide care in the shelter as opposed to them having to get to the clinic, or provide a way in order for them to get to a clinic from their shelter, whether it's providing means of transport or providing support for transport, but making sure that there is programming designed that meets their specific needs, as opposed to, again, kind of this problematic assumption that older people will be provided for by others. That is discriminatory and ageist in the first place, and also just factually from what we see, it's not the case that all older people are provided for by others.
Thanks, Matt. So now from one vulnerable community, the elderly Rohingya, to another with special needs, the children, the young Rohingya living in the camps. We have Athena Rayburn, who has just returned from the camps 3 weeks ago after being evacuated. So welcome. Athena, your microphone is not on. I wonder if you could turn it. Okay, it'd start again. I'm so sorry.
Sorry, I thought I had it on. I will start again. So I'll be talking more about the sort of operating environment and how that has an impact on children and Rohingya families in the camp. So Save the Children, we have a fairly large footprint. So we work across education, health, nutrition, child protection, sanitation, mental health, shelter, food distribution. So through our programming, we reach about 400,000 Rohingya each year. And we also work with the host community. One of the sort of biggest challenges of working in Rohingya camps is the operating environment that has become increasingly restricted. And we can really trace the sort of beginning of this current levels of restriction to August 25th last year. There was a peaceful demonstration of Rohingya on Genocide Remembrance Day, which was closely preceded by a failed repatriation attempt. Following this, the government of Bangladesh, sort of citing security concerns, of which there are some that are legitimate, but sort of decided to implement these policies that in some cases reduce the quality of programming they were able to do. So these policies sort of came over a few months. They started with the ban on the use of Rohingya volunteers. Rohingya volunteers and Rohingya refugees are absolutely the backbone of the response. In our learning centres throughout the camps, 50% of our teachers are Rohingya. We simply can't operate without them. There were further restrictions on the use of cash in the camps and paying and sort of stipends of Rohingya volunteers. There was the mobile data ban that we've talked about. This was also when the plan to fence the camps was announced, and that has started, although it's paused at the moment. We also saw a number of sort of bureaucratic delays with visas for international staff and funding delays. And I think really importantly as well, Rohingya civil society groups, of which there are quite a few operating in the camps, also felt this squeeze and faced sort of increased scrutiny, and some of them had their offices closed down. And of course, I mean, we're almost 3 years in. There are some security issues. There are obviously tensions throughout the camp and with the host community. But the way that these policies were implemented created a difficult environment for us to continue sort of providing the services that we have. If you add this to the new restrictions we're facing as a result of COVID-19, you end up in a situation where the Rohingya population in the camps are certainly among the most vulnerable on the planet. So while it's very necessary that we do as a humanitarian response absolutely everything that we can to make sure we're reducing chances of transmission, as Matt said, our capacity to respond to severe critical cases is very low. We don't want Rohingya to suffer from unintended consequences, sort of if we solve COVID but create a whole host of other problems. So restrictions that are in place, sort of staff number, vehicle access, and the biggest impact really is about a month ago, the government requested that we shift all service provision from essential to critical. Critical services are only health and food distribution. So that means obviously we're doing our COVID activities, health response and ensuring food. But the big thing that got dropped off of that was protection. Many of our protection staff are still able to do some protection work on a small scale, and we're doing sort of trying to pilot remote case management. But of course, any kind of remote operation of services such as case management are very difficult to do without technology or the internet. So education has also been stopped completely, so that all of our temporary learning centres, all of the agencies across the camps have had their education centres shut down since March. We now know that the government of Bangladesh had said schools will stay closed until September. Obviously, we have 500,000 children in the camps. They're incredibly vulnerable, and they're more vulnerable when they don't have anywhere to go. So we really need to be able to pilot sort of distance learning or carer-led education initiatives, or what we're going to have is a population of children that are experiencing something very traumatic, potentially very traumatic and stressful, without any of the coping mechanisms that they would usually turn to, and without any of those support structures. Because it's not just our education that's stopped, it's our child-friendly spaces and all those other sort of child protection services. And as we've heard, the conditions in the camps in terms of COVID, cramped, lack of hygiene facilities, restricted healthcare. We've heard about the misinformation. And again, the misinformation is really something that is fueled by the mobile data ban. One of the biggest impacts of that is that we've seen that it has compromised health-seeking behavior, like positive health-seeking behavior. There are rumors that, health posts are where you'll get COVID. There's a stigma associated with having symptoms and reporting that. So people are not going to health posts, whether they have COVID symptoms or other symptoms. We're seeing less people coming, and when they do come, they're very, very reluctant to spend any amount of extended time in our health posts. If you add sort of this with our practical operational issues, we have very low testing capacity. As across the world, we're lacking in PPE. In terms of treating critical and severe cases, we've got basically zero capacity in the camps at this stage to treat critical or severe. We have a shortage of oxygen. UNHCR has recently provided about 10 ventilators to Sadr Hospital in Cox's Bazar town, but none of them are operational. And in addition to that, we not only have a shortage of sort of the equipment, but trained personnel such as respiratory therapists who would be able to operate them. At this stage, if there was any Rohingya that had a critical case of COVID, they would have to be evacuated. And in that case, there will be a shortage of vehicles able to do this. And the mobile data ban, which also compromises the sort of self-service across the camps, means it will be quite difficult to coordinate swift medical evacuations. We're working to increase our capacity for isolation beds. At the moment, across all agencies, including the UN, we think that we'll be able to get about 1,500 beds for isolation. However, estimates from WHO suggest that at the peak of the crisis in the camps, we'll need about 10,000. So that means that there are going to be a lot of people who are very sick in their homes. We're working to create mobile health teams that will provide care across the camps. We're working to support community case management, supporting Rohingya family members to look after their own family. But despite all of these preparations, we're operating with a severe lack of resources and in an environment that is sort of ideal for COVID-19 transmission and very difficult for us to mitigate all the risks associated with that. And of course, all of this adds up to a really substantive, really sort of potentially devastating impact on children. We know that children are not as affected by COVID-19 as adults, or they don't seem to be getting as sick. But in a context like this, it's really, really important to be mindful of the knock-on effects and really understanding how interlinked and tight-knit this community is, that sort of children are incredibly vulnerable. So from a protection perspective, one of the things that we have already seen since the lockdown started in the camps is an increase in high-risk child protection cases. So high risk will be children who are at risk from physical and emotional abuse. In terms of specific examples, what we're seeing are risks of violence, child marriage. There are a number of reasons for this. First, the closures of facilities means that children don't have safe spaces to go. They're spending more time outside, or they're spending more time in the shelter. This also means that they're more vulnerable to sort of human trafficking. What we're seeing reported from our case management staff is increases in violence instigated by male heads of household. As people obviously frustrated in lockdown, this is something that we've seen across the globe, where you see sort of instances of domestic violence increase. We've also seen a spike in child marriage. This is likely due to the sort of reduced humanitarian presence. Very often we would be able to sort of intervene in these cases, but now we have such reduced staff capacity that they're taking place at a much higher rate. In addition to this, there are a whole host of questions that we would still need to answer in the event of an outbreak. So really basic questions, where obviously the response in everyone at the moment is very laser focused on healthcare and treating patients. But what about when you're in a community this doesn't have sort of widespread healthcare or childcare? Who will look after a child if their parent or caregiver is in isolation? As an example, Save the Children, or obviously one of the largest child protection agencies in the camps, only has about 30 spaces for refuge for children who are in temporary need of shelter. This is obviously not anywhere near enough. And then again, going forward, in worst case scenarios, how do we ensure the safety of children who may lose both or one of their caregivers? We don't have a sense of how that number will be, because at the moment we haven't seen any cases in the camps. But at the height of an outbreak with reduced protection services, there is a real risk that services to look after orphan children will be delayed. And of course, this puts them at further risk. And I've spoken a bit about the healthcare capacity issues that we're facing. We have started to sort of preliminary look at what we can do, where we are sort of working to increase our capacity to support respiratory illnesses. And one of the things that we have seen from our own health posts, or across our health post and primary healthcare centre, we have already observed a 15% increase in upper respiratory infections in the months of February, March and April when compared to last year. Now, it's not possible to say whether or not this is COVID-19. There could be a number of factors impacting that. However, it is a significant increase. And in the absence of testing, many humanitarian agencies are working to try and use whatever data we can to understand whether or not COVID-19 is already being transmitted through the camps, and how we can sort of make sure that we're really right there whenever there's a need for isolation or treatment. In order for this to happen, we don't only need the healthcare, but we need really strong referral pathways, evacuation policies, and of course to make sure staff have PPE. I think it's also very important to make sure that, as we're talking about sort of the restricted operating environment and we're talking about the impact of COVID, we situate this in the wider picture. The Rohingya population in the camps are not just vulnerable because they're in a refugee camp. They're vulnerable because they're completely reliant on external aid. So the lack of access to livelihood opportunities, the sort of lack of recognition of civil society, the no mobile data, no permanent shelters, and no hygiene facilities. These are the sort of biggest things that make Rohingya so vulnerable. So I think it's really important that we as operational agencies working in Cox's Bazar, when we do move into the recovery phase of COVID-19, or at the very least when we come through the first wave and peak, we mustn't go back to business as usual. Rohingya must have access to more self-reliance opportunities. the localization agenda in Bangladesh, which is advancing really quickly, which is fantastic, but it's very focused on sort of national and local NGOs and really needs to include a component of Rohingya civil society. The internet needs to be restored to reconnect Rohingya to the outside world. And of course, Rohingya children and youth, and not just sort of younger children, but those in adolescence, really need access to education and skills building. When we talk about long-term solutions and supporting Rohingya, there is no long-term solution when you have a population of youth that has been denied access to education and skills building for 10, 15 years until they can go back home. And in addition to this, we really need to remember sort of the root causes of this issue, and that is, of course, in Myanmar. And so far, international efforts to sort of hold Myanmar accountable, there are some pieces moving forward. But after this, we really need to make sure that what happens is we redouble efforts to hold perpetrators of crimes against the Rohingya accountable. There can be a perception in the international community that because the Rohingya are in the camps now and they've escaped Myanmar, that they are safe. And while the government of Bangladesh and host community have done sort of global good by sheltering them, this is not any place for a child to grow up. So post-COVID, we really need to remember that it's not just COVID that's made them vulnerable. It's the wider context, it's the impact of Myanmar. And we really need to make sure that we as agencies and governments and the UN are doing everything we can so that Rohingya can finally return home, be safe, and rebuild their lives. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Athena. And that was very eloquent and disturbing in its details as far as so many things. You mentioned that a lot of staff, humanitarian agencies staff have been evacuated. Who is running the local health posts now?
They're primarily being run by our local staff. So one of the good things, as I mentioned, is sort of there is really high capacity in Bangladesh among nationals. So we have been leaning on them. We've been working with Rohingya volunteers throughout the community to sort of get out that health messaging. However, it is difficult when we have a need to sort of at the moment bring in international expertise, especially for medical personnel. It's very difficult to get anyone in the country at the moment. We're obviously, of course, working closely with the military who've taken on an increased role in sort of supporting the COVID response. But I think to echo Matt's earlier point, we would be in a better position if from the beginning of the response there had been much more investment in Rohingya capacity building and actually supporting these community-led initiatives that very much exist and thrive without agencies' involvement. But we should be really acting as a conduit to actually support the work that we're doing. And I hope that after this, in the future, we really build that into our usual way of working so that if there is another shock, we mustn't forget we're in a cyclone, monsoon-prone area of floods. We've avoided a disaster such as that so far. But when that does happen, we really should be making sure that all of our efforts empower the community to respond to that themselves while providing them the support that they need to do that.
Yeah. Well, I hope we will be speaking a little bit later about empowerment and inclusion of Rohingya partners within the camps as far as representatives and but as far as the it was good to hear about the ventilators, the 10 ventilators being delivered, but very concerning that there isn't staff to run them and they're not operational at this point. And the same with oxygen and I'm sure many other things. So it doesn't sound like people are prepared yet for this if it should become a crisis, which is highly likely. I do wonder, though, you mentioned the schools all being closed, and while that certainly makes some sense, I think a lot of NGOs had worked quite hard to bring the schools and open the schools in the first place. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, so there has been a lot of really concerted effort and actually progress in the last few months on the subject of education. In January, we got the approval from the government of Bangladesh to use a formal curriculum. So we were using a Myanmar national curriculum. We were just about to start piloting that in April before COVID hit, and now everything has been paused. I think one of the really important things that we need to do and that we are doing and working with the government to do so, it's one thing when education is paused for a couple of weeks and in sort of more developed contexts that are not camps, in sort of the UK when school is closed, it's if children have somewhere to go and they have safe spaces to be, it doesn't create the kind of risks and issues that it does in the Rohingya camps. And this is where we really need to see education as a life-saving essential service, because we have 500,000 children in the camps. With everything closed, they are a much greater risk. And we know that there are trafficking networks operating in the camps. It's very hard to get a size on it, but we know that children are more vulnerable when they don't have regular contact with humanitarian agencies, when they're not going to school, when they're not learning. And if this goes on for months at a time, of course, that could have real mental and physical impacts on children. So it's something that, as soon as sort of we can have any restrictions lifted, education and those key child protection activities absolutely have to come back as a matter of urgency, because they really are life-saving interventions.
Yeah, thank you. So the last speaker we have today is Osama Siddique, and he has a special interest in the various educational programs. Osama, you're not on screen. Your image isn't up. Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Oh, we can't see you though. Is there a way to get the cam on? He'll be joining us in a second. At least I can't see you, but go ahead and introduce yourself, please.
Hi, how are you? Can you see me now? Hello. I hope everybody can see me. Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me in this event. Thanks, Adam. And I really, when I talk about my people and Rohingya community in the camp and all around the world, I really feel pain because till now we couldn't see any long-term solution for my people, and we're really concerned about the youth and the new generation who are, as Athena said, they denied education for 10-15 years, and last year almost all schools were shut down for a year. No internet connection on the camps, so they're totally not connected to the world. So they don't know what's happening. Even we can't talk to our close relatives in the camp. If we start about this crisis, it's not in 2017 or 13. The crisis gets more popular in 2013 and 17 because the media are focusing more. Social media are more stronger than previous time. I remember my grandparents and my parents, they used to tell us real stories about this, the situations when they left their hometown, when they left their villages, and it's in 60s during the General Nguyen occupation or General Nguyen leadership in the country. And each one of our family has a tragedy, and he has some dark stories in his mind. I have uncle who passed away during the displacement. My wife was a small child when her mother was keeping her in a hole below the home, just to escape from or to keep the kids safe from military attack, when they used to take kids and throw them on fire. And these are something happening since a long time. And wherever in the world, when you see the kids before, there is always a story before sleeping. Like when in the world, the kids, when they sleep, they tell them a story. And when we've been kids, our parents, they used to tell us stories about how the military in Burma, they used to attack our villages and burn houses, and how they were displaced from their houses, and they crossed the river and they reached to Bangladesh. So we know each details of these stories, and how they reached to Bangladesh, where they sheltered. And of course, first first point for our people is Bangladesh, because we are sharing a border with our area, which is Rakhine State, is sharing a border in north with Bangladesh, and after crossing the river, they can reach to Cox's Bazar, and that was a place where they used to seek shelter there, and where we have now more than 1,200,000 people. And then depending on logistics and financial ability, people, they start moving to Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and some of them abroad, so to India or some other countries. So this how the people are distributed, like in different countries. I was lucky that I born out of the camp in other country, and where I get proper education, and but still we still feeling the pain of our new generation who are living without any access of education, or they're getting denied for education. And me and some of my colleagues and Rohingya youth here in the United States and Canada, we think about why we don't do something ourselves. The administration in some countries, they're mentioning us as a burden for them, and some administration, they're not dealing with Rohingya people as a human. And our new generation, if we get them a proper education, they could get the solution themselves. Then maybe we don't need to help from other countries. Then we started Rohingya Welfare Art School, and we can share with you some pictures of our school in Katupalang camp. And we have as well online secondary school education from Canada called Save Rohingya Children Organization. And so this is our focus for now. We'd like to have more and more education for our kids. Of course, in addition on that, we always having a problem with the network shutdown in Bangladesh camp. And we are having, we also have now another issue is with COVID-19, that and from March the schools are shut down again. And being a part of Rohingya community, we know the meaning of how to be a refugee, how to be a displaced person, how to be a genocide survivor, even how to be a stateless. So we always living on a pain of how we can get a permanent solution for our people in the camp. And not only in the camp, even our people in Malaysia who are living as with a refugee status, in Saudi Arabia, a lot of stateless people too, in Pakistan, and in different other places as well. So this is about the camp, but in my contact with my close relatives in Bangladesh, I have some relatives who are displaced in 2017 recently, and they're living in urban area, even not in the proper camp. So they are exposed to mafia, exposed to human trafficking. They are having difficulty for essential needs, and I don't know what the situation will be when COVID-19 will be sneaking on the camp. So this is briefly about the situation, and really the situation is very bad in the camp. So finally, I just want to say, I just want to request for administration who are taking care of my people in their countries, please nowadays try to stop hate speech against my people, because they're in the end they're human as well, and let them get education. Let them get education. When they get a proper education, they, first of all, education an essential need. First of all, they will be useful element in the society where they're living, and as well they will participate in a solution for their own people. Okay, because the whole life they're living on a pain. So when they give them a chance, we will see the results. Thank you, Adam, for giving me this time.
Thank you, Osama, for what you're doing and what your colleagues are doing for your people. And just a quick follow-up question. You mentioned mafias, and what do you mean exactly about those?
For example, especially the people who displaced recently, they live out of camps, like, because most of camps are occupied. So some local people, they are selling them tents, which are getting from charity or from other organizations, to use a mobile phone to talk to us abroad. They need to pay for some mafia to get access for network. And we hear a lot of groups who are who are trying to do business by displacing people to Malaysia or Indonesia by ships. Okay, and it's so it's a lot of stories happening there. Okay, and this is not in the main camp. This is for especially happening for the people who are displaced recently, 2017 and 18, because I have close relatives on those groups. That's why I know all what's happening exactly on land.
Right. I understand it's about exploitation and whether they're traffickers or they're just charging exorbitant rents. There are some people who are trying to profit off misery. But then there are others who are helping. And I'm sure that, we can speak about that. Now, as we bring everyone back together, we're going to be asking some questions both by those watching this program and just that we have for each other. We've been talking about a number of things, and one of the key elements here is about communication, about the restrictions on communication, and also on the issue of misinformation, conspiracy theories, wrong ideas about COVID, and so forth. I was wondering if any of you wanted to speak to some aspect of this theme about either restrictions on communication or bad communication.
I can quickly talk about rumors. I was actually part of a project with Internews where we were tracking rumors, and this was earlier on in 2017, 2018, about various things. At first, it was about food distribution or about vaccination and trying to dispel those rumors. And unfortunately, that program is no longer running in the camps right now. But it was very useful, it was very helpful. They used tuk-tuks, narrowcasts. Basically, they would use very local like audio programs to raise awareness about rumors. So I think those kind of programs are very helpful for the community, and especially as Matt mentioned, especially the elderly, they're not able to really go to focal points. So you will need tuk-tuks and all these other whether they're humanitarians or interpreters, etc., to go door to door to raise awareness and dispel these rumors. So, to be honest, I don't know if there are any programs like that right now, but that would be very helpful.
Anyone else? The idea of that many programs are now shut down is very concerning, and what kids are doing now. Perhaps playing soccer or something. I mean, I doubt they're being restricted to their homes, but I don't know. Maybe Athena would know exactly what goes on. But without school, yes, they are vulnerable to exploitation. Wondering about Bangladesh government policies, specifically about Basan Char. When some of the people did escape the camps and tried to get to Malaysia. and they ended up floating around in boats for 2 months, and no one was taking them, and many died. And this is just recent. Malaysia didn't want to take them in because of fear of contagion, they said, and rising xenophobia. And Bangladesh also hesitated for far too long. Now they've taken in many of these Rohingya from the boats and put them in Basan Char, which they didn't want to open, or rather Bangladesh has wanted to open, but the international community has resisted. Is there anything that you can say to update us on this whole situation? Maybe Athena or Matt.
Yeah, sure. I can add on this. We were one of the first responding agencies to the initial boat of 400 that landed on Bangladesh soil on April 16th. We obviously responded to children on the boat, of which there was a large number. Most of them were separated from their family. Either they had lost a parent at sea or had taken the journey on their own. All of them were severely and acutely malnourished and all in need of urgent medical attention. They were taken to quarantine facilities in the camps and have since gone back to their families and have been reunified, which was one of the key services that we provided. Our concerns at the moment on Bash and Char, as our UNHCR has articulated recently, is that the UN never did an assessment on the island. They were ready to do an assessment on the safety and sustainability, but that hasn't gone ahead yet. So their reservation, obviously, is there is no way that we can say that it is safe. Currently, there are no humanitarian agencies or the UN supplying services on the island. As a child rights agency, our largest concern is the prolonged separation of children from their parents. It is likely that a large number of Rohingya on these boats that have now, I think it's almost just over 300 that are now on Bash and Char, are from the camps in Cox's Bazar. We already know that there are at least a few children that have uncles or their parents who are in the camps. They have made some initial contact at some point, but are not in contact anymore. And one of the biggest issues is, of course, one, urgent medical attention and the need to deliver those services. But for a population, and especially for young children who have already been through so much and have likely been at sea for 2 months, it's essential that the priority is unifying them with their families and getting them back to a safe place where they can get all the support they need. And that's not just support to meet their immediate urgent medical needs, it's their mental health and psychosocial support as well. So our biggest fear is that there is now a large number of children. It's difficult to know the exact number that are on Bash and Char and will be separated from their family for an even further extended amount of time.
If this group is quarantined for 14 days or so, are there alternative ways to do it besides Basan Char?
There are quarantine facilities that UNHCR has set up in the Nayapara camp and the IOM transit camp that they have made ready specifically to receive arrivals. They received the initial 400, and UNHCR, I believe, have communicated this to the government of Bangladesh.
I wanted to ask about the role of military. Perhaps now, this policy of securitizing this situation is advancing further, especially with the necessary retreat of the NGOs. And so what are the implications of this role for the Bangladesh military in the camps? Is this a cause for the lack of partnership with local Rohingya? I understand there's only 4 camps out of 34 camps that allow the UNHCR a program of community representatives, and that there's some kind of system in which the military has handpicked Rohingya liaisons in the other camps, but that there isn't full trust. So this whole issue about empowering and including Rohingya, which seems really essential right now, seems to be not a priority for the military. Is that accurate? Anyone who wants to step in, Matt or AK?
Matt, if you would like to go ahead.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I mean, I think the first thing to say is the military has been deeply involved since the very first days. I mean, I remember I was in Cox's 2-3 weeks after the 25th of August, and you had the Bangladeshi military, kind of very involved in the response and setting up camps from the first days, which is part of the reason or has helped create some of the challenges in terms of what the camps look like in the first place and the challenges that has created in for the humanitarian community and being able to provide services in the camps. I think, Athena laid this out very well in terms of the rising restrictions that have taken place since August of last year, and the fact that those have continued to build in, more and more concerning ways with the lack of mobile data, with the lack of, or with the fencing that has started going up. And so I think everything here relates to the fact that there has been very little, obviously, freedom of movement for the Rohingya refugees from day one, but that has just gotten worse and worse over time. And again, as Athena said, that means no access to livelihoods. That means no access, or very difficult access, or limited access to healthcare outside of the camps, in situations in which the camp clinics or hospitals themselves can't respond to it. And all of that becomes all the more problematic and acute in a situation like we find ourselves in now, with the possibility of COVID-19 reaching there. And so I think the other side of this, though, is in the aftermath of the military's operations in August 2017, you obviously had very loud condemnation from many countries around the world. And I think very frustratingly, we have now seen the world in many ways move on and stop talking about this, stop thinking about this. We have stopped seeing this sort of concerted push from other governments, both related to what continues to happen in Myanmar. I mean, we've focused mostly here on the situation in Bangladesh. There's still at least 600,000 Rohingya in Rakhine State who continue to live in conditions that amount to apartheid, that the UN has said threaten, ongoing genocide. And we're not even, talking about those, and the world in many ways has stopped talking about that as well. In response to COVID-19, the UK development program did provide an additional, I think it was £21 million of assistance to Bangladesh. But where is the further support from other countries right now? Again, Athena laid out, I think, very powerfully the lack of almost everything in terms of being able to respond to what's happening right now with the threat from COVID-19. And so where is the support around the world in order to build up the humanitarian response, in order to provide more funding to meet the enormous needs and the threat that exists? And so again, I think in addition to focusing on the Bangladeshi authorities and the restrictions that have been put in place, we also need to talk about around the world the way that the world is moving on way too much and not continuing to focus on the enormous problems that continue to exist both inside Myanmar and in Bangladesh and the camps.
Mm-hmm. I realize that the root causes in Burma are partly political, and this is going to take some time to work out. We hope it will be worked out. And the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, provisional measures are at least some form of pressure on the Burmese government. We're expecting that process to be helpful to return rights to the Rohingya eventually. But meanwhile, we're in an emergency situation, which is what we're talking about today. We're facing a health crisis as well as structural concerns. With that said, what about the host community in Cox's Bazar? About tensions there, but perhaps more than that as far as potential for partnership. So, is there anyone working there to kind of build healthy relationship between the host community in Bangladesh, in the area, and the refugee community? Anyone who wants to speak on that would be interesting.
I can comment on the work that we do. We work with a lot of people from both the host community and obviously the Rohingya population. And actually, what I would say that we see is that at a micro level, relationships are actually very good. And I mean, the host community were the first responders. They were the people that looked after Rohingya when they were coming across the border in August 2017. They were the ones giving them food and shelter. And while we do hear a lot about tensions increasing and security issues, from my perspective and what I've witnessed, we do still very much see a lot of that solidarity and sort of respect amongst communities. What I will say is that there are obviously a lot of different political forces and sort of things at play. We see quite a lot of demonization of Rohingya and humanitarian agencies in local media, and that can be quite impactful. We can also see the sort of instrumentalization of the Rohingya crisis during local politics. If there's elections, especially, the issue becomes very politicized, and it can be sort of capitalized on by influential figures in the local community that can create this tension. So I would say that something that we see more of now is that happening, and it has started to like en masse degrade relations. However, I am routinely really encouraged and really grateful to see really sort of functioning sort of coexistence and respect. And depending on the camp you're in, the relationship between the host and Rohingya community is actually quite good. Of course, we face a number of challenges, especially when it comes to, like, we do have a large issue in the camps of human trafficking, and there are some issues with drug trafficking as well. This kind of crime operates through networks that have participants from both host community and Rohingya, and very often we might see a disparity in the justice that's delivered sort of to Rohingya as opposed to sort of the host community. So all of these issues do sort of function and can sort of inflame. And last year we definitely had a number of instances where tensions were really, really high between Rohingya and host community. And since the outbreak of COVID, there was an initial first response of Rohingya are responsible for COVID coming to Cox's Bazar because the humanitarian agencies coming from all over the world are coming and they're bringing COVID. So when it first happened, we did experience an increase in incidents of NGO staff being harassed, of Rohingya being harassed, specifically targeted because they were seen as sort of the reason why COVID would come into Cox's Bazar. Again, I would say post-lockdown that has died down, but all of these issues continue to be a concern and can really compromise our ability to deliver services.
Yeah, that's very concerning. AK, you were nodding. Did you want to add anything?
No, I totally agree with Athena. I'm actually thinking about the Myanmar side of this context. There's obviously lots of voices we're hearing about from Cox's Bazar, but having been to Sittwe and various camps around there, information and communication flows are very difficult there. Although the Myanmar government insists that there are barely any cases, COVID cases in Myanmar, we know the truth. The proximity to China, proximity to other countries that have increasing cases, and the very fact that the communities in Rakhine are extremely vulnerable, information does not flow regularly, and hopefully their isolation may protect them somehow, but that's actually what's going through my head right now. Obviously, I just came back from Cox's Bazar in March, but I'm constantly thinking about the population in Rakhine State that are still in IDPs, and even within villages that are cut off and very remote. So that's a concern that we often miss.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought up the IDPs in Rakhine State. I mean, 400,000 or more, perhaps, still struggling to survive. Matt, did you have anything you might want to say about the IDPs?
No, I mean, I would just echo AK. I mean, yeah, we talk about the information blackout in Bangladesh and the camps, and it's basically the same situation in Rakhine, and that the Rohingya there likewise do not have access to information, as he said. And the other thing to add on top of that is there is an active armed conflict ongoing in Rakhine State, including in and around many of the villages where Rohingya continue to live in the northern part of the state. And there's very limited information that's getting out about the military abuses that are being committed in the context of that conflict. But from what we know and what we at Amnesty have reported in the last year on ongoing war crimes, the military has a long-standing pattern of abuses anytime it's responding to a perceived armed group or an armed group, and they're very likely committing many of the same types of abuses here. And so you add that the lack of information on top of that, an armed conflict, and on top of that, just as AK said, the potential then of COVID-19 spreading there, and there being, these communities are largely cut off, not just from information, but cut off from the most basic access to healthcare. That's been a long-running issue for the Rohingya in Rakhine State in general, is the inability to get to hospitals or other healthcare clinics that exist there because of the really tight restrictions that are put on the most basic of free movement by the Myanmar government.
Yeah, I understand that that the military has escalated in the last several months their abuses against Rohingya and Rakhine in Rakhine State, and this despite the Secretary General's call for global ceasefire, and despite many of the militias in the ethnic states, including the Arakan army, saying that they would stand down, but the military is still very much committed to this four-cut strategy of maximum destructive impact on the local civilian population. So this has impacted the health, lack of health services or lack of access to hospitals even further. And I understand that the restrictions on movement also are still very unequally implemented in Burma as a whole. Rohingya are being sentenced to months in jail for breaking some of the emergency COVID social distancing rules, whereas other groups, for example, by praying in congregation during Ramadan in a very small group. I understand that may have happened in Yangon, and yet other religious communities are not treated in the same very draconian way. I hope the social distancing will be implemented, of course, but there's an unequal application of law. Anyway, as the situation in Burma continues to be challenging, the Bangladesh government still is speaking about repatriation, and this is very concerning. Now, there's a question here from Nabil Hassan to you, Matt, about which agencies are there on the ground. This is something that all of you can certainly speak to. I ask, as many charities say they have facilities in Cox's Bazar, but I want to know from you which ones you saw. And then I guess he has a particular interest about ICNA Relief or OBAT Canada. There are groups that work from the Muslim charities, but they're not as well known. So would you be knowledgeable, any of you, about who is on the ground? Maybe AK.
I know OBAT had programs, but once again, due to COVID-19, I don't know if their programs are running right now at this moment. But OBAT did have programs. ICNA, I'm not sure. There's Muslim Aid. There are various local Bangladeshi Muslim organizations that are very active in the camps. But yeah, I can't speak for the current situation though.
Anyone else want to jump in on that? Well, Osama, we're reaching almost the end of our allotted time. I wondered if you'd like to say a few words just to summarize your thoughts about perhaps what can be done in this rather dire moment. You're muted. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, talking to COVID-19 crisis, it's something unavoidable. If people are not following the guideline, it's gonna come. but the situation is how the camp or administration or the camp organizers, supervisors, the organizations, how they can handle the situation. This is the question. I'm living in the United States, and I can see how the situation is handled. It's very difficult, even for a country like United States or Canada, or even in Europe. So for people who are lacking essential needs and living in very tiny places, very less hygienic areas, and I don't know how the things will be managed. For you asked me for a solution, so I can say I don't know.
Well, I think we all are trying to coordinate together, and whether we're part of large organizations or quite small grassroots organizations, we could all use support. And I hope that people will remember us and try to show support, whether by financial contributions or other ways. Every organization could use volunteers. Amnesty International, for example, has a large volunteer membership, as well as researchers and expert staff. So there's many things whether that we can all do for the Rohingya, and I'm sure that we'll put our contact information up, and we hope that people have been interested in to listen to this discussion today, and instead of just being depressed by it, will feel mobilized and interested in taking a role. So we are happy to connect anyone with any of the organizations if you would like to find out more about what you can do to help. So again, we have to wind up, but thank you everybody very much for joining this panel. And we hope that everyone has a good and blessed month of Ramadan. So for social justice, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Adam.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.